All right, everybody, welcome to our Thinking Thursday forestry prep session with our fantastic guests from the USDA US Forest Service to help you get ready for the forestry event and answer your questions about forestry. I'm Dr. John Lohr with Science Olympiad, and we're so excited that you guys have made the time to join us. I hope your seasons are going well. As we get started, we ask for a little small favor from you guys. If in the chat, appreciated if you could throw up your name, the school you are from, and what state. That would be appreciated. All right, and we seem to have we had our first question thrown in. It was question about how long does it take, and Cal, thank you for answering that for us. It's going to be about an hour. As you guys do that, if you want, Melissa, I'll move it to the next slide, and got a kind of a starter question for you to get everybody thinking and give us a sense of you guys a little bit and who's all here. We're going to ask you, we're going to throw up a poll here in a second, and please tell us what tree represents you best. All right, go ahead and click on and what tree represents you best. All right. Looks like we've gotten about, okay, a couple more people making some decisions here. We got everything from the prickly and yet beautiful saguaro cactus to a black willow, the majestic ponderosa pine, the showy flowering dogwood, or the spectacular red maple.
A lot of love for the red maple.
I know. I myself would probably go red maple, but I will admit, of all, I find it to be like kind of a show off when it comes to trees. Tamika, if you have a question, please go ahead and type it in either the Q&A or the chat, and we will get it for you. I saw that you had your hand raised. All right. Looks like we got everybody, so I'm going to end it, and let's see. Here's the results. And while you take a look and see that most people are going with the showy red maple, though second up is the willow, and then we got the saguaro. If you have questions tonight, please feel free to put them either in the Q&A, use that functionality, or also you can throw them in the chat, and we will try and get to as many questions as we can tonight. All right. And at this point, I am going to introduce Melissa Taggart from the USDA US Forest Service, and she's going to tell you a little bit about the work they do, and then introduce our next presenter.
Great. Thanks so much, John. So happy to be here. I will keep this brief so we can get to the main event, but I did want to just say a few words about who we are. We are the USDA, that's the United States Department of Agriculture's Forest Service. Our mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of our nation's forests and grasslands. And we manage a lot of land. So if you've ever been to a national forest and you've seen that sign, there's 154 national forests. There's 20 grasslands that we manage, and that's about 193 million acres. It's about roughly the size of the state of Texas. And you might recognize this guy here. This is Smokey the Bear. And because we manage a lot of forests, we also deal with a lot of wildfires. So we do a lot of work in fire prevention. So it's a big part of our mission. We're super happy to be here today partnering with the Science Olympiad. This is the second year we have supported the forestry portion of the exam. And it is so much fun. And we are so passionate about this and passionate about all of you who are here today. Thank you for joining us. And I will just make a pitch because all of you on this webinar are amazing students and scholars, and we need your talent at the Forest Service. We need your talent in conservation. We are facing big issues, and forests are facing big issues, and we just need all your smarts as you advance. So here's just a snapshot of some careers at the Forest Service. There's so much that makes up an organization of our size. We have about 30,000 employees across the country. You can work in things like partnerships, developing partnerships like the one we have with the Science Olympiad. There are really talented people who manage our visitor centers. You might have visited one if you've gone to a national forest. We have folks who work with tribes and help engage tribal youth in our mission. We have people who are civil engineers and ecologists. And of course, we have foresters. And I will get to our forester in a minute, our expert today, who's going to help answer questions. But how this will work is, I know that some of you have submitted questions in advance. Thank you for doing that. We tried to answer as many of those questions as we could and prepare for them today. So thank you for doing that. But you might have additional questions that come up throughout this webinar. We are going to do our best to answer them. And if we can't get to them, we might put them on the Science Olympiad Q&A after the fact, after the date of this webinar, just to make sure we can get to as many as possible. And we will record the webinar so you can refer to it later. And with that, I am going to introduce our expert, who is in his I'm not sure what this uniform is, Cal, but it's amazing. And this is Cal Oakley is a forester with our Southern Research Station. He's based in Athens, Georgia. And Cal is part of a team who researches how invasive plants enter our country, how they're spread through different types of forests, and what we can do to protect our forests from them. Cal is also our forestry event supervisor, and he did this last year as well. He likes birding, he likes foraging for mushrooms and vegetables, and of course he likes hiking with his dog, who has the most amazing name ever, Doug. So with that, I am going to kick it off with our first question. And I'm going to turn it over to Cal for the answer. So the first question that was submitted it's a detailed question. This is, how do you tell the northern Catalpa from the southern Catalpa? I'm not sure if I even pronounced that right, but over to you, Cal.
I mean, that's how I'd pronounce it. Hi, everybody. Thanks for that excellent introduction, Melissa, and thanks, John, for having us. We really enjoy doing this with Science Olympiad and with all of you participants across the nation. It's exciting to get to share forestry with all of you. I love it. I hope you love it too. Just to dive right in, this is a question we received from multiple people, and I'll be perfectly honest, it's a hard question. They are two very, very similar species. That share a lot of the same range within our nation. So botanists over the many, many years have tried to identify some characteristics that you can use to distinguish the two of them. I have several listed here. In general, the northern Catalpa is going to have a slightly larger leaf. The leaves and the other parts of the tree are non-pungent. That's, compared to the southern Catalpa, which if you damage any of its tissues, especially the leaves, there's an odor that comes off of that. And then a diagnostic feature that is useful when you only have a sample from one or the other species is that in these pods that you see drawn here, these are the fruit of this tree. Inside there is a part, a tissue known as the septum that runs through the middle of that pod, and it separates it into two halves with seeds on either side. And depending on the species, that pod is a different shape. It's rounded in the northern Catalpa, and it's flat in the southern Catalpa. I imagine many of you are listening to this and wondering how on earth you're going to use this information during a Science Olympiad event. And I'll tell you right now, without really great specimens of pressed leaves and pods, these trees are extremely difficult to tell apart. I'll also say, you will not be asked to distinguish these trees on the national event. You may be asked to distinguish these species from other less closely related species. However, because this is a challenge even for botanists and taxonomists, we wouldn't expect you to be able to answer something with complete confidence if the professionals couldn't necessarily answer it with complete confidence. What's important is knowing that there are two species, that they are very similar, and that they represent a unique family of trees within the US. There aren't any other species besides the desert willow, I believe, in the US that are trees within this family, the Bignoniaceae. That's all for these species in particular, but I would also like to mention at this time that these species are a really great example of how you need to be able to look at every single part of a tree to identify it with complete confidence. A tree is not just its leaf, it's also its flower, its fruit, and not pictured here, you know, it's habitat, it's its size, it's its color, it's all of these things that need to be taken into consideration when trying to determine what species you have. You need to look at the whole organism. And with that, Melissa, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide and prepping that question for us, that'd be great.
And this is, how do you identify different types of oaks by their acorns?
So, as I was saying about the catalpas, you need to look at all parts of the tree. When you're trying to use acorns to identify different oaks, you need to look at all parts of the acorns. So here you can see I've labeled the major parts. You've got the cap, the nut. Every cap has scales, and every nut has a tip. I know these probably seem like very obvious and simple structures. However, each one of those, depending on the species, each one of those is going to have different colors, shapes, sizes, whether that's width or length, textures. And then I also have timing listed here because certain groups of oaks take longer to develop their acorns than others. Red oaks typically take more than one season, while white oaks usually mature, their acorns mature in a single season. Melissa, would you mind moving to the next slide? This is the same question. However, here are some specific examples of the way those different characteristics can combine to describe a unique acorn. You know, there's 8 different species here. I'm not going to read through each one, but you know, you can see each has a description of the size, how much or how little of the nut is covered by the cap, the texture of the nut and or cap, the color, all of these things. They're all important for identifying the oak by the acorn. You know, I can't speak for every single test designer, especially at local levels, but I can't imagine you're going to receive many questions that say, this acorn has a fuzzy cap. What oak is it? You're more likely to see questions saying, either describing the entire acorn or showing you the acorn itself. You might have a physical specimen. Just a photo makes it slightly more challenging, but you can still look at the combination of these characteristics, as well as any ecological information that's included with the question to identify the species. I'd just like to remind everyone, feel free to throw questions in the Q&A or the chat. I know I'm sort of moving quickly. and these are dense subjects. Just trying to be as conscious of time as possible so that, we can't get to every question we have here. But other than that, let me check my notes. I believe we're ready to move to the next question, Melissa.
Okay, great. And so this is a question about how do trees provide ecosystem services? And Cal, can you define that ecosystem services? Is that what you're?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can. Thank you, Melissa. So an ecosystem service is almost an economic term. It's any time natural infrastructure or an organism provides a measurable service for us humans. Sometimes it includes for other things. Oftentimes you'll see wildlife habitat and food listed as an ecosystem service, but oftentimes these are benefits from natural systems or individual organisms that have a direct benefit on humans and our environments, the ones we live in. So you can see this diagram here sort of highlights the major ecosystem services provided by trees. In this drawing, we have a single tree, but it is showing you that, the leaves can filter the air for pollutants. The flowers and the leaves can provide food for many organisms, in particular pollinators, which we depend on. Trees provide shade, which also in turn, helps regulate temperatures in cities, towns, and, even next to your house, a shady tree can help cool your own home. Trees sequester carbon, which is a really hot button issue right now. The roots hold the soil together. They prevent erosion. They allow water to penetrate the Earth's surface and filter down through to the water table for us to use. That's in comparison to a paved surface where the water simply runs away and picks up all kinds of pollutants from our built environment. There's also nutrient cycling, structural support for other plants and animals, habitat, and then also a wide variety of social benefits that are often considered ecosystem services as well. If a tree makes you feel nice because it looks nice, that's valuable. And that's a good reason to have trees, both in the places we live and in more natural landscapes. And so one thing I want to drive home about this is this diagram here shows a single tree and the things that it can do. But if you'll imagine an entire forest, all of these benefits scale up with the size of the forested area. So you'll often see people talking about protecting watersheds, for instance, and that usually involves helping them remain forested. And that's because when rain is caught there, the forest filters it. The forest makes sure all that rain doesn't rush out of the watershed, causing floods, putting people at risk, all that sort of stuff. So just keep that in mind. Ecosystem services occur at all scales, and oftentimes they are sort of just the same thing at bigger or smaller scales. So with that, Melissa, if you could go to the next slide. Ecosystem services connect very much with this next slide here.
Yeah. So tell us about urban forestry.
Yeah. So urban forestry is an extremely, well, it's not new at all, really. People have been planting trees in cities for as long as we've had cities and been able to plant trees. However, as a specific discipline, it's somewhat young. As a field of science, it's somewhat young, but it's more or less exactly what it sounds like. It's forestry in an urban environment. Now, how's that different from traditional forestry? You're probably wondering. For those who don't know, traditional forestry is the management of forest ecosystems for a variety of goals, whether that is timber production, wildlife habitat, watershed protection, all of these things, or some combination of them all. That's traditional forestry, and it's traditionally done in rural areas. Urban forestry is similar but different. It is still the management of forests. We call them urban forests because they occur in the urban environment, but you still have a canopy and a variety of species, but the goals tend to be different. There's a much greater focus on some of those ecosystem services that I mentioned previously, especially the social value. There's much less emphasis on things like timber production. You're not going to see anyone planting trees in the city to harvest later to make wood. Trees in cities are planted so that they can ideally live a full life and provide us residents of those cities the benefits that they do. And in that sense, I think I've sort of answered the second question there. Why does it matter? But I'll speak a bit more on that. We've all been in parts of cities without any trees, and they're hot. They often, they get rained on. You get rained on when you're out there.
No shade from the sun.
No shade, exactly. And they look sort of lifeless, not to sound melodramatic, but compare that to a street lined with trees. It's much more vibrant. It's much more comfortable to spend time there. You don't feel like you need to go somewhere else. And that's, to me, why urban forestry matters. And that's often what others describe as well. Besides the social values and the ecosystem services outlined previously, there's also a lot of health benefits to having trees in cities. And they connect to some of those ecosystem services, in particular, the filtration of pollutants from the air. Cities are often full of cars, and those cars are burning fossil fuels, and those have particulate matter in the emissions that we breathe in. We might not see it, but if you have a healthy urban forest, they can collect non-marginal amount of that pollution and prevent it from going into our bodies. So I'd like to draw your attention now, if you haven't noticed already, to the image here and all the different challenges. They have them labeled as the below and above ground stressors. These are all the challenges to urban forestry. And that's another way in which urban forestry is unique compared to traditional forestry. Trees were meant to grow in forests. They didn't evolve to grow in cities. And so there's a variety of challenges that can affect people, and trees, they almost all affect the health of the trees, one way or another. Whether it exposes them to damage or disease or insects, or just deprives them of some of the nutrients and resources that they might normally be able to access in a intact forest. It all makes being an urban forester different from a traditional forester. So I won't read through all these right now. If y'all are curious, I encourage you to come back and look through the slides using the recording later. But we'll touch sort of on some of them here in the next slide. So, Melissa, if you wouldn't mind clicking forward to that.
Sure. Okay, what is wrong with my tree?
So this last thing I want to mention to everyone is sort of about forest health and tree health. And it's a field of study that is enormous. This slide does not do it justice. However, you can think of most tree health challenges and forest health challenges as issues with insects, disease, or nutrition. Insects, a lot of them make their homes in trees. And oftentimes part of that, whether it's, a home for their young, their larvae, or their adult form, a part of that often involves using part of the tree as a resource. And when that occurs in such a large volume, so many insects attacking the same tree or group of trees, it can kill trees and sometimes entire forests. Pictured here is an invasive insect that is causing a lot of problems in the eastern US. It's the emerald ash borer. It, as the name suggests, attacks ash trees. Some other big name insect pests are, what's it called now? Its name was changed recently. I'll try to remember it. But spotted lanternfly is another big one y'all might have heard of. What else? The Asian longhorn beetle is a big one that we're dealing with now. It attacks oftentimes maple species. The spotted lanternfly attacks a lot of fruit-bearing species. That's why it's a concern. But I'd like to highlight the fact that all three of those, the emerald ash borer, the spotted lanternfly, and the Asian longhorn beetle, are all invasive insects. But there are also native insect pests. And the one that's talked about most commonly, I shouldn't say one, it's a group of insects, are pine beetles. We have them in the southeast and they have them in the northwest and everywhere in between. And even though they are native, they can cause really big problems for our pine forests. And they, just like the invasives, they occur in outbreaks that can take a significant toll on forest health and these are a lot of our commercial tree species, a lot of the economic health of certain regions. I'm happy to talk more about insects later. I think there were some other questions. Melissa, thank you. But like I said, it's a whole field unto itself. I'm just going to keep rolling through these examples first. So disease is another common issue for trees. Trees can be affected by a variety of organisms in the same way we can, whether that's viruses, fungi, nematodes is a group of organisms that can be a big problem for certain tree species. What's depicted here are examples of oak wilt, scientific name of which is Bretziella phagoserium. It, as an example, it infests the vascular tissues of the tree, the cells that it uses to move water and nutrients up and down its stem. And in doing so, it can kill the tree. And what you see here is an open canker on a trunk, and then above it, part of the crown dying back, that brown crown. The diversity of diseases is just as diverse as, insect pests. And what I have to mention is the fact that, and nutrition is included in this too, and I'll get to that in a second. insects and diseases and nutrition are often related to each other. You know, pine beetles are a great example because if a tree is healthy, it can often fend off an attack from pine beetles. If the tree is stressed for some other way, maybe it has a disease already, maybe it has poor nutrition, or it's in a drought. When it's stressed out in some other way is when these trees become susceptible to a lot of these threats. And that's why when you talk about managing the health of individual trees, as in urban forestry perhaps, or entire forests, the sort of the style of management is known as integrative pest management. Why is it integrative? Because it's looking at the entire forest system and taking into consideration all the types of things that I just mentioned when deciding how to either prevent an outbreak of disease or insects or treat an outbreak that already exists. I wish I could spend more time talking about it, but it's, as it might sound, it can be complex, and each disease and each insect has different forest management tools and protocols associated with them. So there isn't time to go into all of them, but I would like everyone to walk away with the understanding that managing for these things is, you know, there's no magic bullet that's going to save a forest from an insect pest or a disease. The way to make sure that the health of that forest either recovers or is maintained, you know, doesn't get worse, is through a whole suite of different activities. And now I'll talk about nutrition. Nutrition, you know, every organism requires certain nutrients to be healthy. And plants are no exception, and neither are trees. Nutrition is very rarely a problem for trees in natural forests, unless they are for some reason stressed already. You know, if there's a disease or an insect that, let's say, is damaging all of their roots and they can't take up enough nutrition from the soil. Forest trees typically get a lot of the nutrients they need. In urban environments, nutrition is a much more common issue. And that's just because of some of the stuff I mentioned previously. There's pollutants. There are the soil, the below ground resources are really limited for trees in urban environments. You know, they're put in you can think of it almost like an aquarium tank. They're put in a box of soil, and that's all they've got. So once they've taken up all the nutrients from that area without outside input from humans, it's unlikely that they're going to get any more. And so oftentimes, if you have a tree that looks unhealthy in an urban setting, urban foresters and arborists will consider, well, is it getting all of its macro and micronutrients? Nutritional issues are sometimes easier fixed with a single addition of a particular nutrient. Those ones aren't quite as complex sometimes. However, figuring out which one of those missing nutrients is causing the problem can be challenging. That's all I had prepared for everyone this evening. It was a lot, and I'm happy to talk more about certain parts of it. I'd also like to mention, I know some folks submitted questions through the form that Science Olympiad provided that we didn't prepare slides for. And I'd like to, you know, honor the fact that you used the form and try to address any of those that I didn't touch on already. But in the meantime, if you have other questions, please throw them in the Q&A and we'll try to address them in turn.
Hey, Cal, since you were just talking about it, and there was a question that just came into the Q&A that asked, can too many nutrients or too much nutrients harm a tree?
Yes, but not exactly in the way you think. So without turning this into a chemistry lesson, nutrients for trees, the ability for a tree to take up a nutrient from the soil, let's say, is dependent on the tree's biology, how many roots it has available to absorb these nutrients. But then it also depends on the relative concentration of all the nutrients in the soil, as well as the pH of the soil. The way I was taught to think about it is soil is a solution. We don't often think of solutions as being made of solids, but its functions very similar to a solution, an aqueous solution. You've got all of these different chemicals in different forms distributed throughout the soil. So sometimes too much of one nutrient will make it difficult to absorb a different nutrient. And in that way can cause health issues for the tree. Sometimes an overabundance of a certain chemical or nutrient will also change the pH of the soil. Just like solution, soil has pH as well. And that can also affect the ability for a tree to take up a nutrient. So that's the long answer. The short answer is sort of yes, but not exactly how you might think.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Then another question that came in, Cal, was you've used a couple of different names to describe people that seem to be involved in the study of trees and forestry. You've talked about botanists, you mentioned arborists, taxonomists, foresters. Could you kind of give a brief description of like what they do or how they're different from one another?
Sure.
In making sure our forests stay healthy?
Yeah. So I apologize for using so many words. I should also apologize because some of them I think I might have used different words to describe the same people that I'm thinking about. But I'll sort of start with botanists and taxonomists. So a botanist, we all know botany is the study of plants, and a botanist is someone who studies plants. And I know that's not a very specific definition, but bear with me. Botanists and taxonomists or plant taxonomists, in my mind, are oftentimes the same people wearing different hats, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is a botanist studies plants. They study their biology, their ecology. And as part of that, they study the ways in which the different species are all related to each other. And that is when they are in the role of taxonomist. A taxonomist is someone who practices taxonomy, which is the study of the way different organisms are related to each other. Taxonomists are the people who say, oh, this is a new species, or this thing that we thought was one species is actually two species. Those other sort of professions that I mentioned, I'll go through those quickly. Arborists take care of individual trees, often in human environments. Arborists don't typically work in forests because an arborist is someone who's concerned with the health of individual trees. Foresters, as a counterexample, are concerned with the health of the entire forest. And that often means that the strategies that they use are different. For instance, an arborist might prune a tree because they would like it to grow into a particular shape so that branches don't fall on people or buildings. So that, on a street, you can see past the tree and you're not going to get blindsided by a car coming around a corner, that sort of thing. Compared to a forester working in a forest, you're not going to really prune trees, except in some very specific examples. You're just sort of going to let all the trees grow together. Asterisk. But you wouldn't prune a tree in a forest, right? If it has a branch that's in the way of the tree next to it, that's competition. It's expected and it occurs naturally in all environments. It's not going to cause problems for the forest as a whole. An arborist will often be the kind of person who comes and looks and says, oh, your tree might have this deficiency or your tree has this disease, but they're typically found in urban, suburban environments or around homes. The difference between this, I just outlined the difference between a forester and an arborist. However, an arborist and an urban forester do share very similar responsibilities and roles. The difference between them, again, has to do with whether they're looking at individual trees or the entire collection of trees in an area, the whole forest. So urban foresters and arborists, you'll often find them working together in the same office, but they have different skill sets and different responsibilities. An urban forester, they're going to be the ones making the decisions like, yes, this one tree here is unhealthy. However, we're not going to do X, Y, and Z management because maybe it's very old anyway and likely to be reaching the end of its life. So investing in keeping it alive isn't economical compared to, say, planting a young tree that's going to live with relatively low cost for a lot longer. So they're making these more big picture decisions compared to an arborist who is looking at a single tree and saying, what's going on here? John, were there any other specific titles I missed?
No, I think
any that you think I should?
No, you hit the list, and I think you did a nice job making a distinction there between them and kind of what different people are paying attention to. And actually, the person that posed the question said, "Thank you, Cal. That was a great answer." So you helped them out immensely. An interesting one had come in here about making a comparison between trees planted as part of land reclamation projects. So the example they gave was mine repair. Do they face the same kind of challenges that urban trees do in terms of their environment and that kind of thing?
They can, but I would in general say no. And that's because of a couple things. The things that come to mind are on reclaimed land, trees aren't going to be restricted in terms of how much root space they can grow. And that's sort of a big cause of a lot of the challenges for urban trees. If, like I said before, when they're stuck in this box of soil, they struggle to get enough water and they struggle to get enough nutrients. And on reclaimed land, you're less likely to see those problems. I would imagine for certain specific pollutants, you might struggle. The trees, individual trees might struggle on reclaimed land. However, the goal with reforestation and afforestation on reclaimed lands isn't, again, you can't think of the individual trees. You got to think of the whole system. It's to rehabilitate the whole system. So that first generation of trees that's planted on this land, yeah, it's probably not going to be as healthy as it could have been planted on undisturbed land or unpolluted land. However, they're still going to perform their role within the life of that whole area. And so, although they might not live to be as big or as old as they could in a different environment, hopefully they'll make it so the next generation of trees and plants that grow up underneath them can.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. And thinking about it as opposed to all the trees as opposed to individual trees there. Along kind of the disease or insect pest disease question, and it sort of may relate to like kind of just tree survivability. A question comes in about, do the LBF levels of trees affect how fast insect pest disease can get through the tree or affect the tree?
LBF.
Yes. And if we need to ask them to clarify what to spell out LBF.
Okay. No, it's all about wood hardness.
Okay.
So without doing any specific research, I would imagine that it affects it somewhat. However, most insect pests, I'm going to focus just on insects at first. Some of this does apply to fungi, but actually, I'm going to take a different approach to this. So most of a tree, especially big trees, most of the wood, the part of it that's providing the structural support isn't alive in the way that we often think of things being alive. It's not exactly dead, but the reason I'm making this point is because if something burrows into the center of a tree, the tree will just try to seal that off. We've all seen trees with cavities in them. A tree with a cavity can live for a long time because the tissues that are providing all of the active life support occur simply between the bark and the stem and a little bit of the stem. And that's your cork cambium, your vascular cambium, your xylem, and your phloem. Folks, if they participated in this event last year, should also be familiar with the idea of heartwood and sapwood. So there is a lot of biological activity that goes on in sapwood. And so pests burrowing and consuming that can be detrimental. However, again, they'll be compartmentalized. Heartwood, it's going to be less of a problem. The ways in which trees really get hit is when their cambiums are being consumed. That's often what a lot of organisms target because it's so much more nutrient rich. Wood, there's a reason that termites are specialized, right? Because wood is really hard to eat. Most insects are going to eat that really biologically active, nutrient-rich layer beneath the bark. So that was a long-winded way of saying wood hardness is most often not going to be the main factor when evaluating a tree's susceptibility to pests. That said, it could, affect, sorry, my dog just ran away. It could affect, wood hardness will have an effect on how an injured tree is able to support itself. And that could be a tree that's injured from a pest, or just, sometimes a tree falls on another tree and breaks a large part of it off. The tree will try its best to heal around that, but depending on the nature of the injury, the tree might no longer be able to support itself. But I imagine harder wood, stronger, denser. I'm sorry. Come here. Someone's outside my apartment, I guess. My dog's getting excited. Wood hardness in terms of insects and pests is a much more important variable when the tree has already been made into timber. Okay. It's going to determine, it's things like rot resistance, that type of stuff. Because yeah, you'd imagine a harder material is going to put up a better fight than a soft, porous material.
Hey, Kel, we're getting up close to the end here, and
okay.
A question came in with a group that says they're struggling with tree identification. Do you have any tips on like helping them with better preparing for tree identification, or tips on how to approach tree identification when it may come to taking a test or being in the event?
Yeah, let me think of what sort of big tips I would recommend. I mean, this is some stuff that I mentioned last year during the webinar we did. So I encourage folks to try to track down that recording and check that out. But the big things I would say are, the number one thing is go outside and practice. I think last year and this year I've seen questions asking, how do we use the pictures to identify the trees? Don't practice that way. Practice by going outside with a field guide that you like. There's all kinds of field guides, but it should be one that you like using and are familiar with. And go outside, because once you've been outside and are identifying the trees where they are, touching them, looking at them, seeing the pictures and identifying those pictures after that becomes much, much easier. Doing pictures before actual trees, it's very hard. While I'm talking about field guides, another tip that I like to recommend is try to find a guide with drawings. I know the National Audubon Guide has photos, and that's the one that the event was created using, but photos can be tough. Like these people sort of illustrate from their questions. Photos are tough. I like drawings because drawings in a field guide are drawn to highlight the specific features that you are going to use when identifying a species. Pictures, like a tree won't pose for a picture. It's not going to have, picture's never going to have exactly what you want in it. But illustrations, a talented illustrator can draw whatever part of the tree they want. And so field guides that include those, I think, are extremely useful. Besides that, I mean, I hate to say it because you're all going to boo me, but just practice, practice, practice. I didn't learn all these trees overnight. I've taken, at least 4 different college and graduate level courses that I can think of where tree ID was part of the course. So no one said it would be easy, right? But get outside, practice, practice, practice. And oh geez, what was the other thing I was going to say? And learn, something you can do without a tree in front of you is learn how the different species and families are grouped and related to each other, because that helps a lot when you're looking at something that maybe you've never seen before. You know what I mean? Be able to tell the difference between your hardwoods, your angiosperms, and your conifers, your gymnosperms. And then, within those, be able to say, okay, what sort of hardwood is it? Is it a maple? Is it a legume or a fabaceae? Is it an oak? Those are big groups with lots of species in them. And they share characteristics that sort of let you chisel away at the mystery and then sort of come to a highly educated guess. Speaking as a professional, sometimes I'm in the field, and the best you can do is an educated guess. Like I said, trees don't pose. They oftentimes, they'll surprise you in how they can grow. They don't grow the way the guide says they're supposed to all the time. But nonetheless, that is that species. So there was one other thing I was going to recommend. Oh yeah, that, not at the risk of sounding too artsy fartsy, but I find if you have the time and the interest, illustrating, doing your own illustrations of leaves, or even just pressing leaves and creating your own leaf collection, will teach you a lot more than you might think. The exercise of collecting leaves requires you to go find the tree, identify it. Along the way, you'll see where it's growing. You might get clues about its habitat. You'll see some ecology happening. And then, when you look at that leaf sample that you've got, it'll bring up all those memories of that experience. And those are all useful ways of being able to ID trees. I don't know how many of you have the ear of your local event supervisor, but if you do, bug them to get you some real leaves for those exams, because again, photos are tough. And can't look at the texture of a leaf in a photo really, or the color, is often not great. I'm trying to think of any other big tips, general tips.
This one comes in and it's kind of a specific question that could use
Okay.
it. And they're talking about some of the trees on the list have a whole bunch of, like they say 5 or more possible insects, pests, that, things going on that could affect the tree. Do you have any tips on how do you identify the important ones, or are there, is there an easy way to tell which one you should pay more attention to or know more about than another?
Hard to say, really.
One thing I would add, Cal, it's just my experience. I mean, the test isn't designed to trip you up in that way, right? It's designed to encourage critical thinking, and there's a lot of context that will be given in the question too. So is that one start of an answer there? Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important piece of it.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. What I would say, John, is that the field guide is just the starting place for information, right? I would never expect even a pro to have comprehensive knowledge of all forests, pests, and diseases. They don't. they have big, large books on the shelf behind them that are full of all these things. So I would say I'm almost giving myself away in some ways, saying I don't know everything off the top of my head, which means I'm not going to expect you to. But yeah, the field guides typically have a lot of good information, but it's just the starting point. So if there are things mentioned in the field guide that you want to learn more about, you need to go elsewhere for that sort of information, whether it's online or, in a library. Like I said, there's whole books called, forest diseases and pests or forest pathogens, that type of stuff. And yeah, I'll just reiterate what Melissa said too. We're not trying to trick you. We would never say, here's a tree, name every possible pest it can have and rank them in terms of their.
Yeah. No, and I think if I can add just a suggestion in preparing and see if you guys agree, like if you were to do a Google search or you see news stories about, like in Chicago, we have emerald ash borer beetles. Where okay, if that's a big thing in your area or you see it in the popular press, that's probably an invasive species, a pest, a disease, whatever it is. Like if it makes it on the evening news, you probably should know something about it. Is a great way to look at it. The other way you could do it is if you were to, you might be able to like get away with and say oak trees and disease, diseases of oak trees, and you do a Google search, the diseases that pop up like right away as individual, again, as individual Google, sites or websites or news citations are probably ones that you may want to spend a little more time on than the one you find on the, 5 pages into your search.
Yeah, definitely.
So, all right. We are about to wrap up. There was a whole bunch of questions here that we got that are real kind of specific tips and tricks. And guys, I will tell you, as Cal and Melissa said, keep in mind the nature of it, right? The goal here isn't really to trick you or trip you up. In specific preparation tips, I would encourage you to go back. Cal did, along with a colleague, did a fantastic one of these last year where he really got into great detail about resources and setting up your binders and things you can do to make yourself better. So I would encourage you to go check that one out. And the other thing to keep in mind, there's a question sitting here about working with your partner. I think one of the things you and your partner have to think about, and it's really going to kind of come down to how they present, how the event is presented. So if you happen to go into an event and you're going to get a paper pencil test, I would encourage you to check to see if you can separate that paper pencil test. And like one of you starts at the front of the test, the other starts at the back half of the test, answer as many questions as you possibly can. And then when you get done, you switch. And then when you're still stuck there and there's a couple of questions you're both not sure about, that's when you kind of talk it out and collaborate on it, is really helpful. I think the other thing you can think to do is, if it's another way to prep is like one of you worry about one type of tree. So Cal talked about the gymnosperms versus the angiosperms. So maybe like Cal's going to make sure he knows the gymnosperms real cold and I draw the angiosperms. And that way, as you get to a question or a station and you're provided with samples, like one of you, in theory, you kind of split the list in half and became experts on, just half the trees on the list. Are a couple of things to think about and try and do. But I would encourage you guys to, take a look at the website, take a look at the resources that Forest Service has provided, and we wish you guys luck on your season, and we hope to see you at a tournament in the not too distant future. So thank you guys for coming out.
John,
yeah.
I'm so sorry. I wanted to just interrupt because there was one question in the chat that I would really like to answer.
Sure thing.
That's okay. And it has to do with prep and tree ID, but someone asked, how do you learn to ID trees that don't grow in your area? Yeah. And that's a really, really good question, especially because you do have a list of national species from all over the country. And one tip I have is look in your area for botanical gardens and arboretums, and sometimes even just large parks, because oftentimes that's where people will plant things that are not native to your area. That said, you know, you're not going to find a tree from Florida swamp in an Arizona garden. And in which case, the other sort of resource I would encourage you to look for, and they might be harder to get to, so ask your coaches or your coaches would probably be the best people to ask for to connect with these. They're called herbariums, and they are basically an archive of plant specimens, and they're often found with botanical gardens or universities. The one here in Athens at the University of Georgia is excellent, and they'll let you use the collection. That's what it's there for. It's for people to look at. Not in the way of a museum where you just sort of browse, but if you have a specific thing you're trying to find, I guess think of it like a library. It's a library of plant species, and oftentimes they will have specimens from all over the place, sometimes even other continents. So that word again is herbarium. I'll type it in the chat, but those are extremely useful for finding plants that you just don't have near you.
All right. Thank you, Cal, for doing that one, and thank you for a great question. Is a couple of last minute kind of process questions. We will get a recording of this posted. Everyone that's registered will get the link and the materials sent to your email. We'll also put a link up on the event pages at the Science Olympiad website, which is soinc.org. And just again, thank you guys to Cal and Melissa. It's fantastic presentation as always. It's awesome having you as partners, and we wish everybody great success on your season, and thank you guys for spending some time with us. Have a nice night and have great holidays.
Thanks, John. Take care, everyone.
Yep,
Bye all.
take care.